Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Welcoming in Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar in the fields of biblical studies in the ancient Near East. He's the executive director of the Awakening School of Ministry at Celebration Church in Jacksonville, Florida. He holds a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of The Unseen Realm, Supernatural Angels, Reversing Hermon, The World Turned Upside Down, The Gospel According to Stranger Things. He's the author of a companion to the Book of Enoch and hosts the Naked Bible podcast. You can find more about him at www.drmsh.com. Here to discuss all things biblical and insights into his newest #1 new release on Amazon, Demons, What the Bible Really Says About the Powers of Darkness, is our good friend, Dr. Michael Heiser. Mike, good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Well, very welcome indeed. We spent an hour last time you were on with us laying the real foundation stones for understanding right interpretation, kind of revisit of the unseen realm, which is the foundation for the book on angels, now the additional in the series, the book on demons. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to open up with kind of your general view of where we get it wrong in the demon narrative.
Mm-hmm. I think we get it wrong from really sort of two prongs or two trajectories. One, and we talked a little bit about this last time, is the vocabulary disconnection. We lose the nuanced vocabulary of the Old Testament because as time goes on, things get translated into Greek, and not exclusively, but you get a lot of the bad guys conflated into demons, daimonion. The good guys become angels, angeloi. The New Testament, though, does preserve, a sense of the geographical nature of certain powers of darkness. That's Paul's vocabulary. So we don't lose it entirely, but when we move from the New Testament on into church tradition, we almost do lose it entirely. So we have a vocabulary disconnection, and that not only means that we don't see nuanced terms, it means that we don't understand where these things come from. We sort of lose their history, and not only the way to talk about them, their names, their terminology, but we lose their backstory. And we also have a second problem, and that is, because of our place in history, we're not only modern, but we have inherited centuries of tradition. And there are things that tradition filters to us in both the realms of angelology and demonology that becomes, in some cases, doctrine. And, we don't know that. We don't detect that unless we start recovering really the content of the text in context. So we've got those two things against us. But again, we can get the basics, but we lose a lot of the layering, the nuancing, the interconnectedness that would really answer a lot of questions that people have if they could penetrate, move beyond both of those obstacles. But most people just can't. And so that's why I wanted to write Unseen Realm and then these two other books.
In Unseen Realm and Angels, Demons, much of the narrative begins in Genesis 3, where we're looking at this dialogue, and there's something miraculous set in motion, and that is the enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And this becomes the battle line which is drawn, the protection of the seed line of Messiah, and what's going to come against all throughout history, from the beginning of the garden until the return of Messiah and the new heaven and the new earth, the new Jerusalem, when it's completely fulfilled, and the defeat and the final casting into the lake of fire. This is a perpetual biblical theme, is it not?
What's interesting is it starts with hubris, on the supernatural side with the serpent figure. And in both regards, the humans and the serpent figure, there's also this longing for autonomy, throwing off authority and doing what you want to do. But God is only interested in redeeming the human side of that equation after it happens. So then we get this promise, to Eve. And I think from that point on, there's a boiling antipathy, from the one side to the other, because we do not read of any sense of or interest on God's part to redeem the supernatural being and eventually beings that transgress and rebel against his authority. But we consistently see an interest in humanity. And again, that creates this rivalry and antipathy that again just mushrooms as time goes on.
Is this a clear distinction between divinity, that which is divinely created, which would be angels, or divinity? Man is not, man is man. That God deals differently with the divine creation than he does the human creation?
I think there's an affection factor. I mean, we certainly see that with Israel, where Deuteronomy 7 and 8 answer the question, well, why does God love Israel? Well, because he loves them. Duh.
Right.
I mean, that's what it says. He loved you because he loved you. And I think it goes back even further than that, because, just to use a poor analogy, I think when we look at things, you learn a lot about a person by the way they treat things that are quite inferior to them, whether it be a puppy or just some person that you run into that you just know you need to be patient with, and for whatever reason their circumstances has not put them in the place that you are, or given them the answer to the question that they have, that we're told very plainly, in the Psalms, in Psalm 8, that humanity is lower than the Elohim. So I think that for God to add to a family that he already had, which was, the supernatural sons of God, God takes an interest in doing that again, but in this case, actually making a lesser version, embodiment with all its limitations. God's interest, his desire to do that to something even lower, that he would stoop again another step, as it were, and to make them like him. I mean, to basically do all that over again with something even more challenging and more limited. I do think there's an affection factor, that really gets rolled into this, that comes out more explicitly when God has to restart, a new humanity, after Babel with Israel. And then it's just point blank. I love you because I love you. And knowing that Israel is, again, the little remnant, the kernel, the spark from which, Eden will be restored, back to the original plan. Well, that has to reflect God's attitude of the original enterprise. So I think that there's an emotional connection if we can speak in those terms of God. And I think we can, because, we can sit here as scholars and talk about anthropopathism. The Bible does portray God having emotions, so there's nothing wrong with that. And I think there is, something to be said for that trajectory, that angle.
When we look at the way the church and many authors have approached the demonic realm, they connect them with Genesis 6, but not exactly connected with Genesis 6 the way that you and I look at this.
Some inklings of it and embrace it, and others run from it. For lack of a better way to put it. But even the ones who see it and run from it are a subset of the majority. A lot of them never even see it. So as much as we'd like to poke Augustine in the eye, and you did this because you have an axe to grind with the Manichees or something like that. I'm sure he had other reasons too. At least he saw it. At least he saw this thing he didn't want to see, whereas a lot of them, a lot of these figures didn't see it at all. So
looking at the disembodied spirits searching for a human host, and this is what the quote-unquote demonic realm biblically boils down to. This kind of paints an interesting picture of even Jesus and the pigs, and moving from host to host. That it's searching for a host.
There and you can talk about that neutrally. Okay, well, they're searching for re-embodiment because they come from they're the disembodied spirits of the dead giant clans. Okay, and everybody in the Second Temple period who'd be in the room would say, well, no kidding, we got that.
Right.
But if, again, there are indications, and I allude to one of these texts in the book, that what's going on in Genesis 6 is an out of bounds mimicking by certain sons of God of their creator to have their own human populations. Whether they just thought it was a neat idea, or whether they thought they could do better, like they're correcting something God did, or whether they wanted it to, in terms of a rivalry. I mean, you get all those flavors. But when they lose that, and their descendants lose that, what they have also lost is not just a body. They have lost that potential connection back to this more loved family, humanity, that they seem to be interested in. So it sort of ups the ante a little bit for the pain and maybe the rage, that results later.
It paints a very interesting picture that once you were not family, now you're trying to become family. This is the artificial insemination of what God
have your own by another way. Yep.
What God ultimately refers to as the Gentiles who are grafted in. You who are not family are now sons and daughters. It's kind of him proclaiming that which was unclean now is clean, and we get a certain imagery, not calling Gentiles evil, but looking at the parallels of wanting to join together with the family of faith that has preferential treatment.
And look at the rage that would cause, because when the nations are disinherited at Babel, I mean, the scripture doesn't say this, but you could sort of read into it or read between the lines and say, if you're the sons of God that's lucky enough to get one of these nations, it's like, well, okay, God really does want us to like have families too, that's good, good for us, But then again, for whatever reason, we talked about this many times, that it goes badly. That's taken away. Their children, if we can use this language, their children are taken away when Jesus comes back, and now it's time to gather people from them into God's family. So they lose that too. It's really a story about, this is why I wrote the little book, What Does God Want? God wants a family. It's really not that complicated, but when you have this competition or this hunger to be, it's so ironic. Here you have the gods who want to be like men, want to be like humans because of this relationship, this unique relationship. When you throw that element into it, and then it's either denied or taken away, that just creates a whole new dynamic for just the whole story, but especially in the supernatural world. Again, it's very ironic, but this is the way things play out, this antipathy. And so it would make sense that, well, if we're going to lose our family, we're going to make sure you lose yours too. We're going to prevent people from hearing the gospel and believing it. We're going to distract them. We're going to destroy them. We're going to help them to destroy themselves. It just creates all these subplots these lines of thinking, again, between the rivals that really, you just read all of that in the biblical story. It has explanatory power for the biblical story.
When we look at some of the statements which are attributed both in Isaiah to the I wills, I can't help but reading that every politician quotes from those 5 passages. If I am elected, what does he say? If you elect me and put me in office, I will do all these things. And then we look at the Ezekiel narrative where I always kind of looked at it like, I'm just not going to acknowledge you as king. Like the role you play as Prince of Tyre, you're the king, but I'm never going to refer to you as king because I'm never going to honor you, because the king of Tyre would be Satan. This prince.
Ultimately, because everything dies.
Right.
It's everything. Yeah.
So there's no honor in the powers of darkness. There's no, you can't garner favor with God. You can't force God to love you using powers of darkness.
And why would God make that choice? Well, it's because there was a member of the supernatural family that tried to destroy the other family. There's a guilty party and there's an innocent party. And again, there's a resentment factor, that bubbles up from that story into the other two rebellions, that again has explanatory power just for the flow of the biblical narrative, the meta narrative, the supernatural story, and that helps us address some of the questions that the story creates. In other words, again, it has explanatory power for why the story is what it is and why it's told the way it is and not some other way. We can make sense of it. But if you grow up in church tradition and you're taught to only see one of the 3 rebellions, the second one is just completely off the board. You're taught to not see it, and the third one, we might give people a pass that they never see it because there's an English translation and a text barrier. We're not reading English translations that use the Dead Sea Scrolls in Deuteronomy 32:8, so we never really find out what Babel was about. We can give a pass there, but you still lose 2 out of 3. And those 2 out of 3 are really valuable and serviceable for answering questions that crop up from other passages later on.
How do we explain in the book, how do you explain in the book, where this played out in the Old Testament? We see the transference of sin in the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, where the priest receives the 2 goats and he lays his hand and he transfers the sin, and this is in reference to the unintentional sin of Israel. This is not a national salvation. This is the forgiveness of this particular national sin. As he lays his hands on the goats, one is then sent, and the place referred to is Azazel. But yet there is also an entity
get both.
Whose name is Azazel. And in the taking away of sin to Azazel, to the cliffs, either to be consumed by wild animals or to fall off the cliff to its death, is the only narrative prior to the expression used by John the Baptist, Yochanan the Immerser, when he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." This was the only time that sin was taken away of any kind. All other sin was covered prior to this point. But it also laid the foundation for the laying on of hands and the transferring the sin to the back of Jesus. So he plays a part in the fact in taking away our sin is that Rome lays their hands on him, Israel lays their hands on him, and actually the sin of the world is laid upon his back, and it's all of our sin is like filthy rags, and what does he wear to the cross is these filthy bloody rags. The person of, the entity of Azazel, where do we find that, and how do we understand that?
A lot packed in. There are a couple of questions and sub questions in there. The language, I'll just say to start generally here, the language of the taking away becomes a bit more, I'll use the word appropriate, in the wake of the cross, because you have to have a death before you can have a resurrection, and you have to have a resurrection, for all of this, the whole plan of salvation, to work. And so, since salvation is linked to this resurrection, which is the defeat, the reversal of death, and death had been connected to either the figure, these figures like Azazel, or the place, that was polluted, as opposed to holy ground. When you have the resurrection and the ascension become history, well, those things aren't only just covered now, they are taken away, because this process will never be repeated again. So that there's a sense of that the interconnectivity of the concepts sort of contributes to the way things get talked about. But, to back up even further, initially what we have, with the first rebellion is a death problem. Everything dies now. The humans are driven from Eden. They have lost immortality. Yes, God is going to forgive them, but they're not in Eden. They're not, in the presence of God, the tree of life. Again, all these meaningful metaphors that basically say God is the source of life. To be with him is to live, and to not be with him is to die. So we have this separation. We have an estrangement from God. We have not only humans, but an entire world cursed to die. Everything is going to wind up in the underworld, at the feet of this particular rebel. And so all of that, death, disease, destruction, the things that are lethal threats to life, that would lead to death or cause death, places and people that are inhospitable to life, again, that would lead or cause death. All of these things become part of this, again, this matrix of ideas. Again, they all become metaphorical for everything that now is the opposite of what God wanted it to be. Anti-Eden. Scholars like to use words like chaos. And what they mean is anti-Eden. Everything that is contrary to the way God wants it. And what you have in the other rebellions, again, the bigger deal with the Genesis 6 issue is what humans were taught. They are taught things that do not lead to fixing estrangement. They do not lead to more life. They lead to self-destruction, death, and idolatry. In other words, they compound the first problem. And then when you get the fragmentation of the nations, well, that compounds it even more, because now you have basically all of humanity except for Abraham's descendants, and he doesn't have one yet. Now they're cut off from learning about the true God and how to be in right relationship to him. So we've got just heap upon heap, it just magnifies all these conditions. And this is, again, why in Israel's story, they are like Adam, because God has created them supernaturally out of nothing, or a supernatural act. It doesn't have to be out of nothing. In Adam's case, it's the dust of the ground. And in Israel's case, it's Abraham and Sarah. But again, he creates them when there's no other means or mechanism of creation. And so they're like Adam. They're God's family now. There's no Eden and tree of life that they can go back to, but he comes to them. He wants to dwell with them. He wants to give them a land. The land is flowing with milk and honey. Oh, that sounds like a paradise. Yeah, well, that's the point. Okay, you talk about that place like it is Eden amidst all this other, wilderness, okay? This is why things get get described the way they do. And so you have this one little people, this one little subset in this one place that, leads to the conclusion that everything else is a force of anti-Eden. And we've got conflict now. We've got warfare. We've got a big problem here. We've got Yahweh against the gods. We've got Israel against the nations. We've got Canaan, and every place is, anti-Eden. So the animals that live out in the wilderness, the place that's inhospitable to human life, that could threaten human life, they become, useful descriptions or analogies to the demon-haunted world, okay, to the demonic. You get, the wilderness, the place of, that naturally pollution should be sent, because it sure doesn't belong on holy ground, so we send it out there. And who lives out there? Well, we could call the place by, Azazel. We could call, a particular entity Azazel. You read and I do this in the book. You read in the Second Temple literature. It's the abyss. It's the pit. It's the desert. All of these are words that refer to the same place, and then there's somebody in charge of it, somebody to blame for it, somebody to whom the pollution ultimately should go, because that's where it deserves to be. And this is why in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in other Second Temple literature, you get certain names for this figure develop. It isn't just Azazel, it's Mastema, it's Belial, the worthless one. Beliar is an alternate spelling. Beelzebul, Prince Baal, Lord of the Dead. Well, of course you would call him that. Satan, the adversary. Well, that's what he is. You get all of these terms because people are talking about God's family, sacred space, unpolluted holy ground, and everything else. And so this is a way to map the world. It's the way to map the world you're in, and that world that you're in, that you're mapping, is connected to a spiritual world that now you can also map as well. It's a way of ordering reality. All of these things, who the cast of characters are, what the pecking order is. And a pecking order emerges because what rebellion number 2 and number 3 does or do is contribute to and solidify, concretize, make worse rebellion number 1. So surely there's a common agenda here. And the serpent, Satan, as he's called later, becomes elevated because look at that. This one guy, this one dude, because of what he did, everything dies. God's plan just gets blown up right in his face. He is now God of this world. Because why? Because everything is going to die. It's not going to live. Because then it would be Yahweh's world if everything lives. No, it's not. It's his world because everything dies. So there's a really an internal logic to why we get a pecking order, why, again, the serpent figure is elevated. This is why I say in the book, in a couple of places, look, scholars like to, I'll use the word like with the ones that have an antagonism about them. Other scholars, I think, try to be neutral. But there are scholars out there who love to pit the New Testament against the Old Testament because they want you to lose faith in its coherence as the Word of God. And they'll say, well, hey, we don't have like these hierarchical relationships in the Old Testament. We get them in the New Testament. They must just be making stuff up. They're just freewheeling it out there. They're just making doctrine up. It has no roots to the old. No, everything they say, the data points are in the Old Testament. They're not systematized. They're not arranged. Okay, if I was making a cake, all right, the cake looks a lot different than the stuff that's sitting on my counter from which the cake is going to be made. But it's the same stuff. I don't have a cake without the ingredients. And this is what you have. You don't have what the New Testament says about these things if you don't have the Old Testament. You just don't have it. So that, we shouldn't view these things as contradictory or competing. Or we shouldn't have to retreat to Zoroastrianism or something else, for the New Testament. No, all the data points are there, and people are just working on the data to understand it. It's not rocket science. It's a very normal thing.
But let's establish something. The New Testament, at least the Gnostic Gospels, okay, are literally, until Jesus breathes his last and says it is finished, is all Old Testament content.
It is. I mean, it's really hard. In fact, I don't know that I could come up with one. I'd have to really think about it a long time, and I have thought about it a lot, and nothing's popping into my head. But it would be hard to find something that the New Testament teaches, the seeds of which are not in the Old Testament. I mean, that's pretty difficult. It's not true with Christology. It's not true with the Godhead. The ways of salvation are the same across the Testaments. You've got I mean, what is there? The institutions of the church. They're all going to have a Hebraic, Hebrew Bible history to them. It's really difficult.
There's no other foundation in which to draw from than the foundation which was laid.
Right. The Gnosticism is different because it feels free to draw from more than the Hebrew Bible. Oh, it draws from the Hebrew Bible. Okay, Gnosticism as a system of thought is something that post-dates the New Testament period. But the strands, at least a few of the strands that go into it, yeah, there's Old Testament stuff in there. There's New Testament stuff in there. There's, Billy Bob Gentile down the road. Well, he came out with a book last week. Let's throw a few paragraphs of that in there too. I mean, it's like a vacuum. It's a vortex. Gnosticism, draws things from lots of different strands. But again, the New Testament writers, it would be really hard to come up with something in their recipe for their theology that isn't from the Hebrew Bible.
But even your comment about the polluted area, is this not where Jesus was taken to be crucified? Now that he bore our sin, was to the area of pollution. That all of this was he entered the Golden Gate, but he left through the sheep gate, where the entrails, the bowels of all the offerings were taken to that place called Gethsemane. Yeah. That was the polluted area where the offal was taken.
What happens to him is going to be consistent with the world that has already been mapped. He's not going to violate it. He's going to be consistent with it. Why? So that people can learn the story, learn what happened to him, and then they'll make the connections. It's all useful in the apostolic preaching, and of course the books of the New Testament as they come out. All of these things are important to connect with, initially a Jewish audience, because the Jewish audience is going to be trained, with this worldview that we're talking about. They're going to look for outliers. They're going to look for inconsistent, and it's like the more continuity you can build into the story, both in terms of providence, of how God has things happen, and how those things are preserved in the writings of the New Testament, of course, in their preaching, initially. That's going to be compelling. It's going to be compelling to a Jewish audience that here you have this man, and can you come up, dear Jewish friend, can you come up with a Hebrew, biblical theological typology that this person does not fulfill? Can you come up with that? Wow, how about that?
You can't. I mean, the narrative in Genesis 22, point for point, line for line, is the crucifixion of Jesus. The narrative in Exodus chapter 12, the last 4 days of Jesus' life, outlined very specifically. Days, times, places, events, all of that is laid out in the foundation of it.
Well, I was going to say, what's really interesting is, I have my head now. I've had my head in it for years for this Old Testament astronomy, sacred calendar, prophecy book. And I'm calling that because I don't really have a good title for it. But it's like, even if you look at the the festivals, and you've got the Sabbath, you've got the sabbatical cycles, which of course are part of the Jubilee system, and the Jubilee system involves the Day of Atonement, and all of these things actually have a strong relationship to the flood. In other words, the way these stories are told map over to the way these festivals are structured and observed. And again, all these things are sort of intertwined, where we have creation and then decreation and then recreation. We've got wholeness and purity, then we've got pollution, then we've got again a sanctification. Hit the reset button, because essentially that's what the flood is. It's a reboot. It's what the Day of Atonement is. It's a reboot. You get these things that are these consistent patternings with the sevens. The sevens lead, six of this leads this this place, and then you have an event, then six more comes back down, and there's just a whole lot of stuff like that just going on, throughout not just the Torah, but especially the Torah, that just maps over. It's just constantly mapping over, to the messianic expectation. And what when you mentioned, I can't remember specifically what you mentioned, but when you plug in the circumstances of Jesus' birth, and then certain things he does when we get a chronology to that, it's like, holy cow, like, come on. Even like 42s,
right?
42 parables, 42 miracles. The genealogies, 3 sets of 14. Like, what's going on here? Well, I'll tell you what's going on here. It's content mapping. It's patterning. It's intentional. It's intelligent. It's supposed to make you look at it and notice it, And then when you do that, you consider, like who was this guy? Maybe I should think about what the claims are here, because this is just kind of getting spooky. All this stuff that lines up. Like,
then you throw the 40s in there.
Yeah, the 40s,
and the
the 490s, and
right,
the multiples of 7. It just and there's just a lot of stuff like that.
And so when we look at those 40s, okay, one of those very distinct 40s happens to be the 40 days that they call the temptation of Messiah, the temptation of Christ, the encounter with the fallen, the chief. He was the what would you call him? The arch cherubim. He was higher than the angels, higher than the seraphim. He was the most wise, most beautiful of all, and now he basically from Tevilah, from full water immersion, the breaking through of water. This new creation in the same pattern as Genesis 1. Okay, God
and the Exodus too.
Right.
It's just another echo.
Right. That God doesn't speak until the Spirit falls. I mean, there's no record in the text that in the beginning the earth was out formed void, the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the deep, and God spoke. So Jesus comes up out of the water, the Spirit, and then God speaks, and then he immediately is hauled off by one who apparently has some power and authority to do so. By what power and authority does he have this after God declares that this is my son? How strong is the power of darkness in this new birth? So is he spiritually, he's now born again. This was the Nicodemus conversation. This is the Jewish concept of Tevilah, of full water immersion, mikvah, the whole breaking through of the water, and the death that you take into the pool and the life that comes out of it was a common picture. But so Jesus,
and it's really common because of the way the Gospels will connect that to the Exodus.
Yes.
Which is new life, passing through the sea.
Right.
And who do we meet on the other side? Eventually, it's Azazel. It's the wilderness. We got to go through the wilderness. I think I think that Satan is only as how can I put it this way? Satan is going to get his butt handed to him, but doesn't know it. In other words, we do have the Spirit, compelling Jesus to go out into the wilderness, and here we have, Satan, and of course, he's trying to pull a fast one to milk information from Jesus using Psalm 91. Hey, this is a Davidic psalm. It's an exorcistic psalm, so let's see you do your stuff, and he's proof texting things. Of course, he's leaving things out, like the exorcistic part, and it's gamesmanship. But at the end of the day, what you have here is why does God want this scene to play out? It's not only because Jesus can frustrate Satan because he's not putting his cards on the table. It's to align what happens here with the 40 days of Jesus and the 40 days of Moses. It's just more alignment. It's alignment. Alignment happens everywhere. The echoes happen everywhere. The patterning just keeps getting layered and more layered and more layered. So that when the story is done, nobody's going to be able to look back on any part of it and not see a pattern. There's just patterns everywhere. It's like footprints and fingerprints. So I think a lot of these stories and a lot of these episodes in the life of Jesus happen under providence intentionally to create more connections.
One will come after me, like me.
Mm-hmm.
You are to follow him.
Yeah.
That's why I think that the two words "follow me" that he said to Peter and he said to Levi, to Matthew, why they would recognize by two words who he was. For no prophet of Israel ever said,
right,
"Follow me." As a matter of fact, they said, "Get away from me."
Maybe this is a different, unique. Oh, wait a minute. There's that prophet like unto Moses. Even Mark. I think it's Mark. It's either Mark or Matthew. The dove. Okay, even the dove. I mean, this is where you get. This is how granular it gets, because scholars are like, there's no like dove in the in the story of the Exodus, or peristeron. You're like, what do we do with that term? And we don't really have an exact match. We have like a verbal form in Genesis 1:2, and we've got another one in Deuteronomy 32 with the fluttering and the hovering. But like, what's up with the dove? And you have a couple of things going. Why is Noah sends the raven out first? Okay, and eventually the raven, what? Which one? It's the dove that brings back life, and then goes to live where life is, but the raven doesn't do that, because it's an unclean animal. So you get that thing going on, and doves are clean. And peristeron, by gematria, is the same number as Alpha and Omega. What a coincidence! There's just these things that are embedded in the story. And again, my take on a lot of this is that God knows and understands very well the things that are going to happen. He wants them to happen, because when they are inscripturated, it's just more patterning. It's just going to make the identity of this one so much harder to deny. It's just so much harder. And then, especially to a Jewish audience, and this is God's first interest, but even the Gentile stuff will get looped in. Some of it winds its way into the Gospels, like with the resurrection appearances, but especially in the epistles, it's the same kind of apologetic going on. And those people read the Septuagint. They're not going to miss the other patterning. They're just going to get a little bit more of it from the Gentile world too. It's the same strategy. Like what else does this guy have to do and say and be for you to get it? Like who else can all this patterning be built around better? I just think it's really an intelligent strategy. And so, the bad guys might think, oh, we got him now. Boy, he's in a tough spot here. No, he's actually right where he's supposed to be. You just you just don't see it coming. He's right where he's supposed to be. And 50 years from now, you're going to just, boy, were we stupid. We got played. We got played by a greater intelligence.
So when we go back and we look at this dominion mandate that was usurped in the garden, but was restored to man in Luke 10:18 and Luke 10:19, when Jesus declares, one, the fall of Satan. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, and I give you the authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing whatsoever shall harm you. Was in my mind, the restoration of the dominion mandate, that we now had dominion restored.
Yeah, it's Edenic imagery. Yep.
Restored to us. But yet, we then, from there, move into Paul's narrative of these powers of darkness. And this is where we launch into what the Bible really says about the powers of darkness. We read in the Lot narrative that the powers of darkness, Satan has the ability to be a space traveler. He is the ultimate, going from the atmosphere into outer space, into the third heaven, to the throne of God, and still today that has not yet been eliminated. That last encounter with Michael, where finally sin is cleansed from heaven permanently, that the gate is closed. He still has access. There still is a court. There still is an adversary. There's still an accuser.
What he lacks is any authority.
Exactly.
So essentially, you're going to have this conversation with no one.
Right.
It's you're a prosecutor without a case. Jesus says this in conjunction with the inauguration of the kingdom of God, which is, as you just pointed out, the restoration of the Edenic mandate. This is all Edenic imagery. This is the whole point. Heaven is going to return to earth, and it's going to start right here. With the king. And all this. The one who has fulfilled all these covenants made with men. They're all going to be fulfilled. Everything's going to line up here. So he says this, and it's an indication not of the original fall, because he was cast down back in the days of Eden, but his authority has been removed. Now he's going to still, like Peter says, he's going to accuse the brethren. He's going to run around and basically fill your head with lies. Okay, so one of the clues of the Christian life, the keys, is to stop believing lies. And the answer for that is good theology. But when it comes to him bringing accusation before God as though it means something, it doesn't mean anything to any member of the kingdom of God. You don't own them anymore. They're not going to die. They are in Christ. They're not estranged anymore. So what are you talking about? You're a prosecutor without a case. You're talking to an empty room. And that's the situation that he's in. So the only thing that he has left, he can't appeal to God. He can't accuse the believer. What he's left with is to go to the believer themselves. And essentially play this game, getting people to believe lies. And it's I'm not going to say it's not an effective strategy, because, it is. If people are poorly taught, and not just abstract, theology, but I mean poorly taught to think of simple things like who they are, what God wants. He wants them and his family. How do you get there? You get it by the grace of God. Here's what God did to make this possible. I mean, these are simple but profound ideas, and if he can muddy those or distract you away from looking at them, and in the process tell you that God doesn't love you, or that God will only love you if you do X, Y, Z and do enough of it. A performance pattern that you can't hope to ever achieve. If you're going to believe these lies, then it's an effective strategy. But he can't have the conversation with God anymore. He can only deceive you.
I mean, how do you answer 1 Peter 3:15 with your answer for what the hope is that you have? Hope is always future tense. It can't be past. Well, my hope is that Jesus died on the cross for me. That's 2,000 years old. That's not hope. That's history. All right. What is hope, which is always future tense? What is your hope? It's in his return. It's in the ultimate. Yeah. It's in the closing chapter when it's the destiny of Satan and his minions are revealed and then fulfilled.
The already becomes the present. You know, the age to come becomes the present age. You know, it's this transition. You know, as Jesus was faithful in his work, in history, he's going to be faithful to the rest of it. You know, so yeah, it's forward looking. It's a forward looking that is consistent with what Jesus has accomplished on our behalf. You know, already in the past, and because of that, because the already is here, we can look to the future as a sure hope. Okay, you know, the biblical writers will use blessed hope. You know, so something that they got to come up with some adjective to amplify it a little bit. And that's not a bad one. But yeah, this forward look is as guaranteed as looking back at what's already been done. You know, and it is an important concept. You know, the return of Jesus doesn't hinge on us, or how good I am, you know, how successful I am, you know, thinking, you know, believing a lie that I have to do enough so that God has a nice disposition toward me. It doesn't depend on any of that. It depends on him. You know, he's not going to fail. You know, he's never failed at any of this. He's not going to fail at this either.
It's fascinating that we see it played out as Satan goes to Judas. He has an encounter, and we know who it is, but we don't know in what form he is. For there's no description given as to, it's just Satan enlists Judas into his service.
And it does make you wonder, what exactly was Judas aware of, if anything? Like what's the Judas part and what's the Satan part? You know, like how do you parse that? Because we just don't have the details.
Right? Is this a possession? Even as a follower of Jesus, does this open the door to possession at a time where you could believe in Jesus before his fulfillment as the final sacrifice? Was there, and we know that there was demonic possession because we see legion. We see that. We see the Talmudic question: how many angels can you fit on the head of a pin? How many demons can you fit inside one human being? The number. But so is this a demonic? Because we're not. The encounters describe the action, or really the result of the action, that he enlisted him. Does that mean he possessed him? We don't know. It's not explained to us.
Yeah, we don't have many details when it comes to that, and the language can go different ways, which contributes to the ambiguity. Some translations will have Satan entered into Judas. Again, that's interpretive. It could be on the table, again, because if you have to ask yourself questions like, if Judas really believed in Jesus, would he be doing this? Well, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So the fact that he is doing this would suggest that he's not really a believer. And you get these episodes in the Gospels where Jesus, in some cases pretty harshly, distinguishes followers from disciples.
Yes.
You know, it really upsets people when he does. Is that what we've got going on here, or is the language just describing manipulation? I mean, at the very least, it's describing that. But you know, is there something else on the table here? So yeah, we're not quite given the sort of language to be completely conclusive about it. But at the very least, he's a tool, for sure. I mean, that much you can say.
Absolutely. This is part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Michael Heiser on his new, and I was glad to see you're number 1 in all 3 categories, and no longer are you in that Catholic slot that I just couldn't. I read your post. I thought that was from the Babylon Bee, first of all, but that was actually true. So you and I were having a dialogue over the weekend, and that came up. But this part 2, because there is a part 3, and the part 3 is going to take us into the third aspect of this, and this is that Pauline aspect of this, powers of darkness and how they operate today, even this day, as we walk out our salvation with fear and trembling. We've been talking with Dr. Michael Heiser, author of the new book, Demons, What the Bible Really Says About the Powers of Darkness. You can catch him right here on the third Monday of every month in the 12 o'clock hour, and we will do part 3 of Demons next week, and then we're going to put it out as a combined. We're going to condense all 3 segments into one and put it out there on our featured guest channel that you can now see on ignitinganation.com. Dr. Michael Heiser, Mike, always great to see you, always great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Fires me up, plants some new seeds in me, and that's what I love about the time together. So God bless you, my friend, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Shalom. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.